for having me this morning, and my dog Sam. Yeah, she'll kind of probably just walk around and maybe sit and stare at you a little bit. I'm shipping out on Wednesday back to Kabul, so it's kind of nice for me to be able to take her everywhere with me. I work in Afghanistan. I've been doing this work for about 17 years now, since I was a teenager. And I've been going there for the last 10 years, so I've made about just over 40 trips since the end of the Taliban regime. And I work in the education sector, and I'll tell you about the work that I'm doing in the sector. But first I'm going to give you just more of a general overview of the Taliban period in particular, and what's happening now, focusing on the status of women and girls. And maybe a little bit of review of the conflict of the last 3 decades in the country to give you some background, because myths about Afghanistan are very, very prevalent, and it's always been frustrating for me to sort of have one foot there and one foot here and see what I'm seeing on the ground there, and then coming back here and sort of seeing the portrayal of the country in the media. So our organization is called Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, but we just say Women for Women because it's a bit of a mouthful. And we've been around since 1996, and we have chapters across Canada, including here in Vancouver, one in Victoria, one in Kelowna. And I did want to mention before I forget that we have an annual general meeting and symposium that's open to the public, which is themed around education and the human right to education every year in a different Canadian city. And this year, it's going to be in Victoria. So if anyone's interested, you can find the agenda on our website. We have speakers coming from Afghanistan and lots of interesting workshops and events. So that's October, the first weekend of October. So I'll just start by asking you, what do you think of when you think of Afghanistan? Burkas?
Sand.
Sand? Questions? War, abuse? Yeah, so these are pretty typical responses. People typically think of it as a place of tragedy and desolation and poverty, and all those things are true. But there is another side to the story of Afghanistan that we don't get to hear as much, and that's more what I want to tell you about, because the media is not as interested in telling that side of the story. It's a country that does have sand and deserts, but it's also a very mountainous country that has landscapes like this. It's incredibly diverse for a small country. It's only about the size of Saskatchewan, but because it's where the Hindu Kush starts, you have every kind of climate and geography. You have over 50 languages spoken, dozens of different ethnic groups. You have people as diverse as the Hazaras, who are descended from the Mongolian troops of Genghis Khan, who came to Afghanistan in the 12th century, and they look Mongolian. And then you have the Nuristanis, who are descended from the troops of Alexander the Great, so they have Macedonian heritage. And then the Pashtuns and the Tajiks, and the Shais and Uzbeks, Turkmenis, so very, very diverse. This is in near Mazar-e Sharif in the northern part of the country, so there's desert there and camels, but it's also rocky and mountainous. This is in a place called the Panjshir Valley, just north of Kabul, so beautiful rivers. Water management in Afghanistan is a hugely challenging issue because all of its river systems start and end in other countries. And Afghanistan is landlocked. It's bordered by 7 different countries, with the stands to the north, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and then it shares a very, very small border with China, where if you look at a map of Afghanistan, the Wakhan corridor, this kind of arm that stretches out, reaches into China, and Kyrgyz people live there. This is in Badakhshan, which borders Tajikistan, and then in the west you have Iran, Pakistan to the east. So it's always been kind of at the heart of, it's the heart of Central Asia. And the term the Great Game was coined for Afghanistan because both Russia and Britain really, really wanted to control Afghanistan because it was sort of the gateway. It's the Silk Route. It's the route by which you'd access India. And the term geopolitics was actually coined for Afghanistan because it was so strategically placed in Asia. So this is the Blue Mosque in Mazar-e Sharif, a famous landmark, an old, very old mosque, about, I think it's about 1,000 years old, and another old mosque in Balkh, Balkh was a city that's now just a mud village with some cows wandering around, but it was a city founded by Alexander the Great. And actually all the major cities in Afghanistan were founded by Alexander the Great: Kandahar, and Mazar-i-Sharif, and Herat city. And Kabul was the seat of the Mughal Empire. So from Kabul, Babur, the emperor, ran all of India and what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh from Kabul, and he's buried in Kabul. And this is actually the park where his grave is, and it's just recently been rehabilitated by the Aga Khan Foundation. And this is very kind of old traditional wood carving. So old houses in Kabul and Kandahar look like this. Unfortunately, now the city's been a bit invaded by these, we call them poppy palaces, these kind of shiny mansions that are more inspired by Pakistani architecture than Afghan. But there's a very, very rich tradition of handicrafts and pottery made in an area called Isfahan. And Isfahan is a beautiful valley near Kabul. And it's so beautiful that the Taliban are said to have destroyed it because of its beauty. And that's very telling about the Taliban, and we'll talk a little bit about their ideology, which I consider to be death cult, where they're sort of pursuing violence for the sake of violence. And it was very interesting when I went to that valley, and I asked people, why did they destroy it? Why did they burn all the trees and they burned the villages? And they said, because of its beauty. And this is embroidery from Kandahar. Of course, a major carpet industry in the country. Women do most of the labor, men make most of the money from it. And then henna and some of the other kind of traditions you see in the region. There's a long and rich literary heritage in the country. You've probably heard of Rumi, and you probably know him to be a Persian poet, but he was actually born in what is now Afghanistan, but at that time was part of the kind of broader empire that encompassed Iran and Afghanistan, Khorasan. So he was born up in near Balkh village, and his tomb and the school he studied at are still there. And then Hafez is, of course, another famous Afghan poet that people are still able to recite today. Even illiterate people will know the poetry of Hafez and Rumi by heart. And then one you probably haven't heard about is a poetess named Rabia Balkhi. So she's Rabia Balkhi because she comes from Balkh province, also in the north, so the same area as Rumi. So she was his contemporary. And she lived in the 10th century, and she came from a family of nobles. And she fell in love with the slave of her brother, who belonged to her brother. And her brother was furious about this, and he locked Rabia in a bathhouse, a hammam. And it was there that she slit her wrists and she wrote her last poem in her own blood on the wall of the bathhouse. So this is a very famous legend in Afghanistan, and every woman and girl can tell you this story and can recite the poetry of Rabia Balkhi. And in fact, her tomb still exists. This is it, and women come to pay their respects. And it's sort of underground, and I went there years ago, and I know it was years ago because the only way to get into the tomb is to squeeze through this little hole, and I was skinnier back then. I don't think I could actually do it now. And only women are allowed to go there. So the kids are kind of curious, what the funny Canadian lady was doing. And you'll find, girls all over Afghanistan are named Rabia. A lot of hospitals are named after Rabia, the Rabia Balkhi Hospital, or radio stations, women's organizations. So very, very diverse traditions, just given the landscape of the country and how isolated one area can be from another, and all the different ethnic groups. So, one version of Islam or one version of Pashtunwali, the kind of tribal code there, can be completely different a few villages away. So it's very hard to generalize about the country. And here you just see a few of the different kinds of dress codes. So this is taken at a wedding. So weddings are a time when anything goes. Women can have short sleeves, no sleeves, stilettos, they'll wear pantyhose. They can kind of wear anything at a wedding during celebration times. This is a woman farmer, this is a young Pashtun woman in Herat. And generally, girls will start veiling around puberty, and they'll be pretty free until then. But the veil comes out, and shortly thereafter the burqa. But the burqa is by no means prevalent all over the country. I'd say Kabul, maybe 20 to 30% of women wear it now. whereas if you go south or to the eastern parts of the country, all women will wear it. And some provinces you'll go, you just won't see any women at all. They don't go out of their houses. And same with men. This is a Badakshi, someone from Badakhshan, in the northeastern, most remote part of the country, and an elder, or the younger Afghans call them the Whitebeards. This is a Pashtun man, but he's wearing a Tajik hat, which is the Pakol, famous Pakol hat of Afghanistan. And then this is a high school principal at one of our schools, and man up there in the corner is a lawyer in Kabul. So you have kind of the urban elite that has really reformed in Kabul in particular, and some of the other bigger cities, as education opportunities have become more prevalent. Afghanistan is one of the youngest countries in the world demographically, so about 65% of the population is under age 25, which has its upsides and its downsides. So all those young people are going to need jobs, and they want educational opportunities, and they need social services, and that could be very destabilizing to the country because the country's not really poised to handle that. But at the same time, these young people are a very, very different generation from their predecessors. They want change. They're disillusioned with warlordism, and in many cases with extremism, and they're very exposed to the outside world. Afghanistan has a thriving independent media sector, so they see other places and people, they see how other people live. Internet penetration is spreading quite a bit, and the media has really been sort of one of the good things of the last 10 years. These are some Hazara kids. The Hazaras mostly live in central Afghanistan. And this is a book, a collection of Afghan songs that our organization helped produce. So just turning to the story of women and girls. I'll start at the Taliban period, because that's actually when I got involved. So the Taliban came into existence in 1994 in Kandahar. They didn't exist before then.
And there were none?
No, there were none. They formed in Kandahar, and their kind of founding myth has different variations, but one version is that a young woman was raped, and the Taliban, Mullah Omar, the one-eyed leader of the Taliban, a local mullah, sort of rounded up a band of local militants, and they captured the perpetrators, and they hung them in the streets, and they declared that there would now be law and order. And at this time, there was a civil war, so there was a lot of lawlessness and a lot of sexual violence and pillaging and so on. And so then they kind of rode on their horses and then spread that harsh law and order throughout the country. Another version says that it was a young boy who was raped, but either way that they captured these rapists and hung them, and then took control of Kandahar. And then they captured Herat in the west in 1995. And then they got Kabul in 1996, and that's really when they became the de facto government of Afghanistan. And then they got Mazar-i-Sharif in 1998, and they never got the northeastern 10% or so of the country. So they controlled about 90% of the country. And in 1996, I was a 14-year-old, a grade 9 student, growing up here in Vancouver, and I was kind of interested in rights and justice issues, and I was, a 14-year-old, so I was also a bit of a troublemaker and going through all that teenage angst, and my mom was thinking carefully about how to channel all that energy, and there was a newspaper article in the Vancouver Sun about the Taliban and about the rules that they had imposed on women and girls once they had taken power. So my mom cut out this article and left it in my room, and I came home from school, and my life has never been the same ever since. It just turned my world upside down. And I think at the time, I was completely enraged and felt I had to react, and I did, but I probably didn't quite imagine that I would still be at it almost 20 years later. So, so the Taliban, just a bit on who the Taliban are. I'll get to the previous chapters of the war in the country, but the country had been at war for 2 decades by this time, and millions of Afghans lived outside the country, especially in Pakistan, in refugee camps all over the border areas of Pakistan. And that's where the Taliban's real recruiting grounds were young men and boys from these refugee camps. These were boys who were illiterate, some of them were orphaned, all of them were poor, and the Taliban had a promise to them putting them in madrasas or boarding schools where they would be fed and clothed and sheltered, and they would get training as militants and Quranic lessons. And these boys were removed from their families, so they had no contact with any females. Sexual violence was very prevalent in the madrasas. So if you combine all those things together, it was a very lethal cocktail that sort of produced the Taliban. And then these were who were sent out to conquer the country and to control the lives of women and girls through the religious police, which was called the Commission for the Prevention of Vice and the Promotion of Virtue. So what were the rules for women? Firstly, they shut down all the girls' schools right away. The general idea was that women and girls shouldn't really be part of public life. They should stay at home. So they closed everything from K to 12, universities, colleges. They were all closed. Women were told they shouldn't work. And you know, it's common to think that Afghanistan has kind of always been backwards and maybe women didn't work anyways. And I'll get to how that wasn't quite the case, but you ended up with women who were doctors and nurses and lawyers who were suddenly trapped at home in a country that had been at war for so long that there was a huge number of widows. And one of the other rules was that women were not allowed to leave their homes unless they were accompanied by an immediate male relative, a chaperone. So many women didn't have a husband or a father or anyone who could take them out to get groceries, and women were literally starving to death as a result of this. And because the healthcare sector had depended on women primarily, and they weren't allowed to work anymore, and the Taliban made a rule that men couldn't treat women. Male doctors couldn't treat female patients. So women were denied access to healthcare, and women were dying of treatable conditions, minor car accidents, diabetes, asthma, because they just didn't have access. Mind you, there were underground healthcare clinics and there were underground schools, but they definitely didn't reach you know, anywhere close to a majority of the population. So they had to have a chaperone, a rakan. Windows had to be painted black if women lived in the house. The Taliban believed that the very sight of women was corrupting and they shouldn't be seen. And then there was just a whole bunch of kind of trivial rules, like makeup was illegal, nail polish, shoes that made noise, white socks. You know, I actually have the original white socks. I have the original list of edicts, and you just wouldn't believe the stuff on it. And then, of course, there were rules that applied to everybody. These are some of the things that were banned. Toys were illegal. Any non-religious books were not only banned, they were actually gathered up in piles and burned in public places, which may remind you of previous events in our history. If you've seen the film or read the book The Kite Runner, you'll know that kite flying, a favorite pastime of Afghans, was also forbidden. Museums were closed. And Afghanistan has a fascinating multi-religious past. It was a center of Buddhism, of Zoroastrianism. There was a thriving Jewish population for a long time in Afghanistan. So there's amazing historical artifacts from all of those past periods. And the Taliban destroyed everything they could because their idea was that anything that was un-Islamic or depicted a living thing should be forbidden. And there's an amazing story, I won't have time to tell you, but of how the Kabul Museum staff hid as much as they could underground and inside walls to protect it, but the Taliban got about 80% of it. And then music was all illegal. So imagine living in a society without music. All television stations were banned except for the Taliban's religious station, radio and Sharia TV. And men had to pray 5 times a day. After dark, no one was allowed out in the streets. And men had to grow beards and they weren't allowed to wear Western clothes. And a lot of my friends, male friends in Afghanistan, said they had fake beards that they would wear when they went out and they'd take them off. And you know, people broke all the rules. They had secret music cassettes, and I think that's a really interesting untold story. So just to give you some context, how did this happen? How did this, hey, Sam.
Stop that.
She doesn't like the Taliban. Yeah. So how did this Islamo-fascist group come in and instigate what I think is the most misogynist regime in known history? They came into a situation, a very broken country, that had had really no rule of law for decades, where people had kind of turned back towards their tribal traditions because they couldn't rely on their government. Their government wasn't protecting them. There were no police. There were no public services. So how did all this start? Afghanistan was a monarchy for the last... I don't know what she's doing.
Chasing shadows.
Maybe it might be the buzz. Actually,
Sounds kind of
it's kind of
light.
buzzy.
The
If I
mic.
just speak really loud, can you hear
Yeah,
me
it's
fine like
fine.
that? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's forget this. So Afghanistan was a monarchy for the last 300 years or so, and it was a pretty progressive monarchy with a modernization agenda. And in 1973, when the king was actually out of the country in Italy, and he was actually literally in a bath at a spa in Rome, his cousin deposed him. There was a bloodless coup. So his cousin, whose name was Daud Khan, took power and ended the monarchy and formed a republic. So that happened in 1973. And Daud Khan was quite left-leaning. He was talking to the Soviets, but he was also talking to the Americans and the French and the Germans and so on. And he, at this time, because higher education rates were rising and universities were opening all over the country, the university campuses became the site of all of this political organizing. So you had communist parties forming, and it really started at the universities. You had what would become the Mujahideen groups, the fundamentalist, extremist groups forming, the democratic groups forming, and everything in between. And then there were the Maoists and the Leninists and so on. So it was a very heady time, and one of the parties that really came to the fore was the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Communist Party, the PDPA, and they took power in 1978. But they had a very tenuous grasp on power. They weren't popular, and they murdered Daud Khan and his family, 17 members of his family. But they were not going to be able to keep power. And right away, the Mujahideen formed, the freedom fighters. So they were the kind of fundamentalists, but not all of them were that fundamentalist. Most of them were. They formed into different factions to fight the communists and get rid of them because they saw them as a godless group that had taken power. And it was in 1979, Boxing Day 1979, that the Soviet army came in and invaded the country. And it's long been disputed how much they actually wanted to do that. And now we're just starting to get to know how it actually all panned out because all the Soviet records were really covered in darkness before now. But we're just starting to learn that they were actually quite hesitant. They weren't really that enthusiastic about this idea, but ultimately they were convinced to come in at the urging of the Afghan PDPA party, and they started an occupation that lasted for 10 years. And in which many thousands of Soviet soldiers died, as well as millions of Afghans. So this was an interesting time because it was kind of a mixed bag. In the cities, you had a great modernization drive, a lot of freedoms for women, but at the same time, it was the Soviet Union, so they were repressing all dissent, and they were very brutal, especially in the countryside, in trying to subdue the Mujahideen and the communities in which they were hiding. So they stayed for 10 years, and then of course the USSR started to disintegrate in the late 1980s, and the Soviets were exhausted. They were very unpopular. The Mujahideen were getting stronger and stronger. They were being financed by the CIA through Pakistan, and ultimately the last Soviet soldier left in 1989. Now the PDPA hung on to power for about 3 more years, until 1992, and they might have lasted longer, but at this point the world was just sick of Afghanistan and the war there kind of turned its back on the country, and then what happened in 1992 was all those Mujahideen factions that had been fighting the Soviets started fighting each other, because they all wanted power. And there were 7 main factions. Some of them were very, very extremist, and some of them were less so. But they all turned on each other, and that happened in Kabul. And so you had sort of different neighborhoods of the city were under different factions. And this was by far the most destructive time in the last 30 years of conflict. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed just in Kabul city. There was just epic proportions of sexual violence. There was just no law and order at all. If you lived in one part of the city, the line might be, if you had an aunt in another part of the city, you couldn't go to that part of the city. there were massacres, there were just absolute atrocities taking place. So this was a very, very brutal time in which the Mujahideen proved that they might be able to fight the Soviets, but they could not run a country, they couldn't run a government. And people were fleeing throughout all these periods, but especially during the Mujahideen time. They left in droves, and all the educated professionals were the first to go. So that just kept weakening the country more and more. Afghanistan ended up with the largest refugee population in the whole world, and to this day, that's still the case. And so it was into this vacuum that the Taliban came with their promises of law and order, and this kind of harsh response to the lack of basic protections that people had. So they were initially maybe not welcomed, but people were just, they didn't fight them. They were too exhausted. So they came in pretty easily. And the world was also not really paying attention. The UN had tried a peace process in the 1990s, and that failed. And so they came in pretty easily, and it looked like they were there to stay until 9/11. And then you're probably more familiar with what happened after that. So there's now the government of President Hamid Karzai. Since December 2001, an interim government was formed, and then the first elections were held thereafter. So at this point, I just want to mention some of the myths I see most frequently about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is in Central Asia, not in the Middle East. It's often conflated with Iraq. Even my own grandfather tells all his friends, you know, my granddaughter works in Baghdad. She's always going over to Baghdad. So it's, you know, it's not an Arab country, and Central Asia has quite a different history and culture and ethnic groups than the Middle East. It's very romantic to say that Afghanistan has never been conquered, and that's absolutely not true. It has been conquered many times over the last couple thousands of years by all kinds of regimes, from of course the Soviets to to Alexander the Great, to the Macedonians and the Persians, and it has conquered itself as well. It's conquered other countries. I mentioned the Mughal Empire, and so on. So it's kind of taken in the other empires that have conquered it into its culture and history, and also influenced the region around it. Though it's people love to say things like it's the graveyard of empires. Many people get the Mujahideen and the Taliban mixed up, because the Mujahideen groups, like the Northern Alliance, which is still around today, that were funded by the CIA. And the Mujahideen were actually fighting the Taliban. The US, to my knowledge, never actually financed the Taliban, though you could say they had a role in creating them, because the Taliban were created in response to the Mujahideen situation that the US had sustained. So Mujahideen are different from the Taliban, and to this day, these two groups are still fighting together. Afghanis is the name of the currency, and not the people. Nothing irks me more than when the people are called Afghanis instead of Afghans.
So what are they called?
Afghans.
Oh.
Yeah.
Like the rug.
Like the rugs.
Afghans. Yeah. And Afghanistan means land of the Afghans. The U.S. is not in Afghanistan for oil. You can come up with all kinds of sinister reasons why they might be there, but there's no oil. There may be a gas pipeline that will go through eventually, but it's not a hugely lucrative undertaking. There's massive mineral resources, but this is just another area where people get Afghanistan and Iraq confused, I think. And actually, all the evidence really sort of points to the U.S. just wants to get out of there as fast as they can. So it's kind of funny here where people are coming up with conspiracy theories about the U.S. wanting to control Afghanistan, where from the perspective of Afghans, they say, we're more concerned about them trying to, abandon us and leave as quickly as possible. And I've heard it said in all kinds of ways that Afghanistan is inherently backwards. The people there are primitive. It has no history of modernization, and it's sort of a hopeless lost cause. So at this point, I just want to give you a little bit of the history of the 20th century and some of the a history of some of the tensions that keep coming up in Afghan history up to this day and back then. So this is Queen Soraya, and she was the queen in the 1920s. She was the wife of Amanullah Khan here, and I think he came into power in 1919 and was a huge modernizer and undertook an ambitious campaign to spread education education, and they were sending Afghans abroad to places like Turkey for university education. And Queen Soraya herself was university educated. She had studied in Lebanon. And she was a very key public figure in that she was always out there making speeches to her countrywomen, telling women to stop wearing the veil, that girls should go to school, that women should work, that it was their responsibility to help move their country forward. And her husband never went anywhere without her at his side. She went to military parades, she traveled Europe with him. And what I've read of what she said, I can very confidently say that this was a feminist. At a time when it wasn't very common for women monarchs in Europe to hold those kinds of views. But in the end, they ended up pushing too far. And the story of Soraya, maybe they didn't, but the British got involved, and this is the context of the Great Game, when the British and Russians are vying for control over the country, and they're both trying to influence what happens there. Amanullah Khan was not cooperating with the British, so he was useless to them. They decided, we need a new monarch to work with, we can't work with him. So they took this photograph, British, and they distributed it in the countryside. And when all the mullahs saw the wife of the king in a sleeveless dress sitting next to a man she wasn't married to, there was a revolt against the regime. And Amanullah Khan actually had to abdicate. So that happened in 1929, and that ended that particular modernization drive. And then another modernization drive started in the 50s when things had calmed down a little bit. And you still to this day see those tensions between the countryside and the city, and the urban elite and the rural mullahs. So things were sort of plodding along, and by the 1960s there was an elected parliament. There were women in the parliament. There were women going to university, studying in all different sectors. There was a lot of interaction between the outside world and Afghanistan. So this is a record shop in Kabul in the 60s, and you could buy the Beatles records. And of course, during the 70s, Afghanistan became a key stop along the hippie trail, as droves of Canadians and Americans and Europeans traveled in the country and found it to be a largely peaceful country and a safe country. This photo is from the 1980s. So as I mentioned, the Soviets were quite progressive on women's rights, though most of those changes were focused on cities. And again, that's the case today, where most of the change that's happened has been very urban-centric, whereas women in the countryside are likely living the same way they have been for centuries. This is the Afghan women's basketball team in St. Petersburg in the early 80s, and some university students in the 1970s in Kabul, so it was co-ed, and it was a 50-50 breakdown roughly between male and female university students. And about 40% of doctors were women during this time, and 70% of teachers. And you can find women in all the professions. Lots of women went to study abroad, especially into the Soviet Union. And to this day, a lot of the educated people sort of in their 40s and earlier can speak Russian. But at the same time, you had, old traditions maintained. And so you had this kind of peaceful coexistence of the conservatives and liberals, and but of course under the yoke of the Soviet Union. And then this is the image that we're more familiar with of Afghan women today. And certainly the burqa is still around, but it was around long before the Taliban. You'll find it throughout the region, and it might take a little bit longer for it to disappear altogether. So this is Afghanistan today, and as I mentioned, you'll find the burqa, but you'll also find women back in public life, walking out in the streets, working. These are some young people that are part of a group called Young Women for Change, and they're always out in the streets demonstrating. And I think this time they were painting a banner when I ran into this cafe, and I think it was a demonstration against violence against women. And then girls, these are some students. So schools have reopened, and I'll get to education, but just to consider some of the impacts that are very much still lasting from this 30 years of conflict, 30 years plus. It's just the incredible loss of life, the millions of people that died. There's no Afghan that hasn't been affected, that hasn't lost a family member. As I mentioned, the refugee population, though many people have come back, some have tried to maintain ties outside of the country because we don't really know what's going to happen in the next few years. So successive brain drains, where the country slowly was building an educated population, intelligentsia, an art sector, and then all of that would have to start again, and people would leave at different phases of the conflict. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world, though human development indicators have dramatically improved in the last 10 years, and I'll give you some examples in a bit. And it's also one of the most illiterate places. So to this day, only about 20% of women are literate, and about 40 to 45% of men. But the education sector is on a rebound now. Weapons are everywhere. People rely on them. It's really kind of been integrated into life. So you see things like people firing guns at weddings, and they call it a tradition, though they didn't do that 30 years ago. But most people in the country weren't there 30 years ago. So just the prevalence of weapons, and people still relying on violence because they're not used to having a government that can solve problems for them. So they turn to tribal councils and things like that, and you just see a lot of interpersonal violence. The rule of law has not been one of the strongest areas of progress. There's a lot of work to be done to improve the rule of law, and just the destruction of infrastructure. And I'll give you some examples of that, because we mostly don't know what Afghanistan looked like before the war. So this is a picture before the war. In the 60s, a bridge that was built, I think by one of the European countries financed it, and then that's the same place now. So you see both the bridge is destroyed and there's no water, which is another problem they're facing. These are some pictures from an American man who was living and working in Kabul with his family in the 60s. These are his two daughters. And this is a park, a popular picnic area outside Kabul in the 60s. And this is the same place now. So I'll show it to you side by side. So, and if you talk to any Afghan, there's a small Afghan community here in Vancouver. If they left, if they were living in Kabul before the war, they'll get pretty sad right away. Talking about the beauty of the country and the gardens and the greenery and the rivers, because that's mostly gone now. So this was the palace, the king's palace. It's called Taliban, just kind of on the outskirts of the city. It was built around the turn of last century, and this is it today. It's a very haunting place. It was often occupied by different factions during the Civil War, and the Americans were in there for a little while, and now mostly squatters live there, and it's heavily mined. So that's the inside. And you see scenes like this, still in Kabul, just incredible destruction. On top of the fact that Kabul is the largest city in the world that has no sewage system. It's all open air sewage, no running water. And it's a city that was designed for about 500,000 people, and there's about 5 million people living in it now, and it's just heaving under the population. But you'll also see scenes like this. A lot of rebuilding, a ton of economic growth. Afghanistan in 2009 had 22% annual economic growth, which is way higher than China's, and that's actually taking out the illicit economy, so opium. So not counting opium, they still had 22% growth. And in Kabul, real estate prices are like comparable to Vancouver in rents and what it costs to. So if someone wanted to buy one of these new condos, they would be looking at least $100,000 for like a 1 or 2 bedroom
It gets less
condo
rain.
city.
If it gets less rain, maybe we should move there.
Yeah. So this is the Kabul River. This is actually a beautiful part of the city even now, kind of in the central old bazaar area. These are really old buildings from the turn of last century. And this is an old picture because the Kabul River actually has water in it. It looks more like this today. It usually isn't even that full. And it's filled with garbage. It's definitely not safe water to drink. You'll see cows wandering around down there. And that brings me to the fact that one of the greatest challenges that Afghanistan is going to face in the coming years is the environmental crisis that it's currently experiencing. It's incredibly polluted. Kabul very often looks like this. There's days where I actually feel high from the pollution. You're just so lightheaded. You're breathing in, the result of people burning tires in the streets, of a lot of exhaust. Afghanistan's kind of the graveyard for old cars from all over the world that would never pass air care here. And right now, most babies born in Kabul hospitals have lead in their blood detected. So that is going to kill way more people than the Taliban will kill. But it's not really a problem that's being well addressed. But some of the good news is that this has been really a kind of revolutionary time for women. The changes are immense, and it's easy to say that they're not good enough or not enough has changed if you're sort of looking at the situation now. But I'm fortunate enough to have some hindsight and to know what this country looked like when the Taliban were on their way out and what it looks like now. And one of the biggest changes is just that women are back in public life. You see them outside, you see them on TV, you see them in the parliament, you see them working in offices and running businesses. They participate in the political system, and I'll get to more on that in a moment. They run businesses of all sizes and shapes. There's been a huge influx of both men and women into the higher education sector. There's universities in every one of the country's 34 provinces, though not enough seats for everyone who wants to go. About 80% of Afghans have access to basic health care now, whereas less than 20% did under the Taliban. And reduced mortality overall. Life expectancy was about 32 up until a few years ago. And one of the most dramatic areas is maternal mortality. So for many years, Afghanistan had the highest maternal mortality rate in the world. To give you a sense of how bad it was, in Canada, maternal mortality is around 12. So that means that for every 100,000 babies born, 12 mothers die. And in Afghanistan, it was 1,800 per 100,000 births. And in one part of the country, Badakhshan, it was 6,500 per 100,000. So, that meant that a woman was dying in childbirth every 30 minutes in the country. And today, there's been a couple of surveys done, and they have different results. But one survey had 300 as the number, and they said this can't be right. That we can't have gone from 1,800 to 300 in 10 years. So they said let's make it 500 because we're skeptical. So the official maternal mortality is 500, but it could in fact be better than that. And just the reopening of schools. So I want to tell you a little bit about education, because that's the sector I work in and what I'm passionate about. Literacy is about 35%, though very different for men and women. 20% for women and closer to 45% for men. Primary school attendance is 55% of kids who should be in primary school are enrolled in school, and then it drops to 32% for secondary, at the secondary level, and that's much more dramatic for girls. Especially around age 12, between primary and secondary, there's a huge drop-off of girls. Girls start to get married, they're older, the families don't want them out, they pull them out of school. So gender parity, which is the number of girls who go to school for boys, at the primary level is 0.74. So that means for every 100 boys in school, there's 74 girls in primary school, and then it drops to 0.49 for secondary. So for every 100 boys in secondary school, there's 49 girls. So that's a big area of concern. But one of the highlights is just the change in the metrics. So when UNICEF started working with the Afghan Ministry of Education to reopen the schools, and this included for boys because there were really only madrasas for boys during the Taliban time. So there was about 1 million boys attending school during Taliban and madrasas, but they weren't real schools. And so enrollment in 2002 was 2.3 million. And today it's about 8.5 million. So a pretty dramatic increase, and with lots of girls back in school as well. But that still means that about half of kids who should be in school are not in school, and that's attributed to all kinds of reasons, and I'll come to that. Now, what I see as the main challenges, I think we've made progress in quantity, in building schools, in enrolling students, in building teachers' colleges, and getting teachers back working. There's about 170,000 teachers in the school system. Where the challenge lies now is in the quality of the instruction that they're getting. So that's hugely challenging. The Afghan government, and particularly the Ministry of Education, suffers from all kinds of problems, including corruption, including just incompetence. They still can't do basic government functions like get good statistics or good monitoring over their school system. So the Afghan government's capacity to actually run the school system, it's almost entirely dependent on foreign donors right now. And then the quality of the teaching and of the textbooks. The textbooks are just garbage, even though they're all financed by the donor community. No one actually looks at what's in them before they're printed. And it's largely rote learning, memorization. The teachers are mostly untrained. About 70% of teachers have no training as teachers. And most of them also don't have any post-secondary. And a good number of them also didn't complete high school themselves, but they may find themselves in a position where they're teaching high school students. So, so just the quality of instruction, infrastructure at schools, things like science labs and school libraries, and just toilets, not to mention sometimes the building. And then violence against the education sector, because the Taliban have made education, especially girls' education, an explicit target. They're not casualties. They're going after female students, female teachers, parents of girls who go to school, principals, and government officials pushing for girls' education. The school day is about 2.5 hours long, and so they don't get a lot of classroom time. Their subjects are 30 minutes each, and so because of the lack of school buildings, they use a shift system. So 2, 3, or even 4 shifts might go through one school in a day. So for example, a school we work with in Kabul has about 9,500 students in 4 shifts a day. So I wanted to mention a study that I worked on last summer with UNICEF, which is the Afghanistan Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey. And this is a survey that UNICEF tries to do in most developing countries, where they look at the situation for women and children, and how countries are progressing on the Millennium Development Goals, so the 8 MDGs, and what progress Afghanistan has made. So in the Afghanistan survey, we looked at a whole bunch of different indicators, so mortality rates, things like maternal mortality, nutrition rates among women and children, child health, things like vaccination, people's access to clean water and good sanitation, reproductive health, how many women deliver in a medical facility or with a medical attendant, child development, child protection, so things like child labor, access to books, literacy and education, and HIV/AIDS. And so I wrote the report for the AMIC survey, and as I was going through all this data and looking at the background characteristics of the respondents, things like age and wealth and education levels and where people lived, if they were urban or rural, and then all of our findings, I quickly noticed that the single greatest predictor for every single indicator was the mother's education level. I mean, you could just set your watches by it. If the mother was educated, the chances of her kids being in school were way greater, of the household having better access to sanitation and clean water, of there being more books in the home, of the kids not being engaged in child labor. It was just incredibly dramatic. So we definitely tried to highlight that. And this is just a good example of why I think the education sector is the most strategic place to work, and why the donors should really be focusing on that above all else. I think it's really the solution in Afghanistan and in other countries for changing the status of women. So where does Afghanistan sit today, and what's going on with women? It's hard to generalize, to say that the women are all liberated, everything's going great, or that they're that things are still the same as the Taliban. It's sort of something in between. And Afghanistan is famously complex and full of contradictions. And you can find all kinds of extremes there. And I'll just give you a few examples in terms of women. So you will find 7-year-olds who are married, who are sold into marriage and married to much older men in a financial transaction. And you'll also find happily married adult couples who met in university and have very healthy marriages. You'll find millions of girls who should be in school but are not. And in this picture, you probably can't see it that well, but these are child laborers. These were girls I met last summer who were pitting apricots in Badakhshan. But you'll also find millions of girls in school again, and many of them very ambitious. Any kid in Afghanistan, if you ask them what they want to be when they grow up, they say doctor. Maybe 1 in 20 will say something else, but everyone's kind of shooting high. 80% of women are still illiterate. And one of the really appalling findings of the AMIC survey was that even of women who went through primary school, if they stopped and they didn't go further in their education, only 30% of them were still literate. So they were going through all their primary schooling and not actually becoming literate from it. So that's a huge challenge. But you'll also find, highly educated professional women. You'll find the greatest misogynist to ever walk the earth. This is Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, who comes from Kandahar, a village in Kandahar province. And this is my friend Ehsan, who comes from the same place that Mullah Omar comes from. And he runs a kind of community college, very market-oriented college that teaches business classes, computer classes, English classes. And thousands of girls have graduated from his college and have gone on to become the breadwinners for their family. And he's never left southern Afghanistan. And this guy will quote, Locke and Hume in the same breath that he'll quote Hafez. He's, just probably one of the most enlightened, progressive human beings I've met anywhere in the world. And he comes from the same place as this guy. So it's a mixed bag. So our organization, Women for Women in Afghanistan, we've been around since 1996. We're a registered charity in Canada and also registered in Afghanistan. We have a country office there to run our field programs, and I'll tell you about that. So we have kind of a twofold mandate. One is the work that we're doing in the education sector in Afghanistan, and the second is to try to raise awareness and to educate Canadians about the needs in Afghanistan from a human rights perspective, especially the needs of women and girls. And it's a little bit more challenging to keep people engaged and interested at this point. So this is our structure, not that interesting, but we have a board of directors, and we have chapters across the country. So as I mentioned, there's 3 in BC, and we're totally volunteer-based in Canada. All our staff are in Afghanistan, and I'm the only non-Afghan staff, part-time, and I'm kind of here and there, commuting between Kabul and Vancouver. We have 2 big programs. The first is called Afghanistan Lo Ali. It means Afghanistan Reads in Pashto, and it's a network of community literacy centers which serve as both libraries and literacy classes in rural areas. It builds on work we've been doing for many years. And I'll give you some more specific examples in a moment. But the other big program is called Investments in Basic Education. And those are projects that we do that try to improve the quality of education. So teacher training is one of our major areas of focus. And we've trained about 4,500 teachers in the last 5 years. Within the basic education program, we also run a couple of schools. So these are pictures from our Fatima Tulzara schools, which are in the north of the country and in Kabul. And these are schools for very, very poor kids that can't afford to go to government schools. And we provide them, with their education as well as things like school lunches and uniforms and books so that they can actually get into the classroom. The teachers are very, very well trained. And the budget, it costs us about $80,000 a year for both schools. As part of the Afghanistan Reads program, we set up mini libraries. They're called ABLE libraries, Afghanistan Box Library Extension, ABLE, ABLE. And they're like libraries in a box. They sort of are like almost like a bar fridge or something, a mini bar fridge. And they open and they're on wheels. And a small version has 250 books. And a large one has 500 books. So we put them in high schools, and then we put them in our literacy centers for out-of-school literacy learners.
What languages do you need books in?
Dari and Pashto. Yeah. We do put some English, we get some donated English books, so for the centers that are interested in English books, we will add them, but most of them are Dari and Pashto, and they're printed and written and illustrated in Afghanistan, which is quite unique because the country doesn't really have a publishing sector. And you can see that they're short, because they're really for new readers and illustrated. So they're like booklets. So we've distributed about 150 of those libraries. They cost $1,500 for a big one and $750 for a little one. And we're trying to get another 100 out there. That's our wait list at the moment. So out of the public education system, we run literacy classes for adults. and girls who don't go to school, usually because their families wouldn't allow them to. So these are some of the students in our literacy classes. We're running them in 9 provinces of the country right now, and I'll just read you the quote in case you can't see it. It's from Zainab, a 14-year-old student. She says, "I want to continue my studies in the future if my family allows me, and I ask of the organizers of such courses to continue these classes and expand them to other parts of the country also." So in our literacy classes, we also do life skills training. We cover things like reproductive health and human rights, because we can kind of hide them in basic literacy classes. Don't tell anyone. So in the Afghanistan Reads program, we're covering about 450 students, though I think we're going to hit 500 this year. Literacy students a year and 11,000 library users a year. And we train the teachers, both in how to be a good teacher and also how to use a library and promote reading and really reinforce literacy. So there's a major capacity building component to it. And this program is funded in part by the US government, and we're also working with the Linda Norcross Foundation in the UK. We work with an orphanage in Kabul that is unique because it's a beautiful facility. It's very, very unlike the state-run orphanages. And it also uses the Montessori program. So it's a training center for Montessori there as well. There's 33 kids live there, boys and girls. And other donors have helped run it. We cover about 20% of the annual budget. It's $80,000 a year. So Women for Women gives $25,000 to $20,000 a year, and they raise the rest elsewhere. So it's just an amazing facility. The kids are really thriving there. And this is our teacher training program. We call it Fanus, which means lantern in Dari. And it comes from a proverb in Afghanistan that a teacher is a candle that burns to enlighten others. And we train in-service teachers, so teachers that are working in the school system but have never been trained as a teacher. And we teach them active learning methodology to get them away from the rote memorization. And we're very focused on science education. So we teach hands-on science, and then we equip their school with a science lab so that they can actually apply the skills they learn in our training. And after we've trained them, the Ministry of Education certifies them. So they are then a trained teacher, which means they get a paid upgrade. We've done about 4,500 since 2008, and we're trying to do 1,000 a year to keep a pace of 1,000 a year for the next 5 years. So we've done that in 4 provinces. There's 170,000 teachers in the country, so we've got a ways to go, but we're going to peck away at it. And we also try to give a lot of capacity support to our trainers. Our trainers are all Afghans, so they get a lot of professional development training. We brought a group of them to Canada last year. They visited schools in Canada and teacher colleges and took training courses. And then they do a lot of kind of demo work. We have Afghan Canadian experts in education go there so that they can train them in Dari. So this is an early childhood education specialist who's Afghan Canadian and lives in Vancouver in Kabul with some of our trainers. So this is expensive, costs about $400 a head per teacher to train. So we set up the Lantern Fund to finance the teacher training for the next 5 years so that we can try to hit 1,000 teachers a year up until 2018 at least. And then we just do a lot of capacity building because we spot things when we're working with partner organizations there and with schools, like core project management skills or financial accounting skills. So we're always doing training and trying to improve the capacity. So these are some of the trainings that we've done. Some of them are thematic, like reading promotion, library programming ideas. So what can you do in your library to get people interested, having parent and child reading hours, things like that, book clubs. And then some of them are more technical skills like project management or external communications. And then we got into this spring environmentalism, oddly enough. We're an education NGO, but we're really alarmed by the environmental crisis in the country. So we were the first NGO in the country to write a green policy that said that we're going to operate in a green way. And then other NGOs were interested in what we were doing, so we decided to tell them how we did it and to coordinate a network of NGOs that are interested in being greener in the way we operate. So that's one of our areas of interest. We have an incredible staff team in our country office in Kabul. So these are some of our staff members. They're just amazingly dynamic, and they work really, really hard at great risk to themselves all over the country to make these programs happen. And we also got into social enterprise because we're worried about next year when the U.S. troops are leaving and there being less funding, and wondering how we're going to sustain our programming. So we went into business, and we opened a couple small businesses. We opened a guest suite for mostly visiting expats who want a safe place to stay, a safe and comfortable place. So if you ever find yourself in Kabul, do come and stay at our suite. It's a really nice, very comfortable setting. It has AC and high-speed wireless internet, and it's very, very secure. So we've been renting that out for the last year. And we also rent office space to other NGOs, and we rent our conference room to other NGOs, and we charge fee for service for training as well, because we have a lot of experience in different areas of training. So we're trying to earn some of our own revenue. This is all on our website. If you go to our website, you'll see this button. You can click that to get information about how we try to be accountable and make sure that money from Canadian donors, because we're all funded by Canadian donors, is well spent. And we were also one of the first NGOs to introduce an anti-corruption policy because corruption is so prevalent, not only in the government, but in the NGO community as well. And we try to practice what we call small aid. Small projects that we can manage and have good oversight over, and we know what's happening day to day in those projects. We're not managing multi-million-dollar projects, but very grassroots projects. And everything is very carefully monitored, thanks to our staff team there. Yeah, I'll let you look up more on our website there. But we do have, because we're volunteer-based in Canada, we are able to send 97% of the funds that are donated here to the field for projects there. So I just want to end by saying that things are getting better. Even though you mostly hear the stories of tragedy in the country, there's a lot of triumphs that you don't get to hear about as well. And I would have given up this work a long time ago if I didn't see incredible change taking place. I mean, just mind-blowing change. It helps us keep at it. There's no shortage of inspiration when you see, a class of teachers graduating or a girl becoming literate for the first time. But change takes time, and it demands support from the outside world and interest and solidarity. And I always warn heavily against cultural relativism and these ideas that, it's okay for girls not to go to school in Afghanistan because that's their culture. I think that Afghan women would be the first to tell you that it's not cultural. It's just criminal. It's just about controlling women and about sort of men hijacking the situation and keeping them under lock and key. So things are getting better. Education is the key. And this was very dramatically illustrated in the story of Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan, the Swat Valley. Of course, you probably know who she is and her story. And the Taliban really foiled this one. And they tried to shut her up, but she was unintentionally made world famous. And the Taliban should be scared of girls like Malala because they are the greatest threat to the Taliban's way of thinking. And we have to stand by them at all costs, because if they're brave enough to keep going to school when their teachers have been murdered and their parents have been murdered and principals have been beheaded and their schools are getting burned down, school wells are being poisoned, girls have had acid thrown at them on their way to school, and they keep going to class anyways. So this is a message to us that we have to listen to very, very carefully, at our own peril if we don't, because we live in a globalized world. And what happens in Afghanistan impacts what happens here. And if we really think of ourselves as global citizens, then we will recognize the moral standpoint, the need to support girls' access to the human rights education, and that it's just the smart thing to do. When you look at those findings from the AMIC survey, I showed you that if we're interested in ending poverty,
and improving people's quality of life, then the education of women and girls is the solution to doing that. So it's just smart development planning, and I think it's the right thing to do. And and I think that way, as a humanist, two questions I often get are, do you do this because you are Afghan, or you have Afghan heritage, or do you do this because you're a Christian? I do it purely from a human rights perspective. I'm an atheist and humanist, and and I do it because that's what I've heard on the ground from Afghan women and girls. This is what they want, and I found Afghans to be pretty much just like us. At the same thing, at the end of the day, we want the same things. They want their kids to make something of themselves. They want to live in dignity. They want health and happiness, and to live in comfort and not in pain. So we have to focus more on those similarities than on the differences. It's easy to focus on the differences and to make it an exotic place that we can kind of romanticize in our heads. But the inconvenient truth is that we're very, very much alike. So sorry for talking your ear off. I'll stop there, and hopefully we have